Hey, all, Scott Horton here. It's always safe to say that one should keep at least some of your savings in precious metals as a hedge against inflation. And if this economy ever does heat back up and the banks start expanding credit, rising prices could make metals a very profitable bet. Since 1977, Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. has been helping people buy and sell gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and they do it well. They're fast, reliable, and trusted for more than 35 years. And they take Bitcoin. Call Robertson Roberts at 1-800-874-9760 or stop by rrbi.co. Hey, all, Scott here. On average, how much do you think these interviews are worth to you? Of course, I've never charged for my archives in a dozen years of doing this, and I'm not about to start. But at patreon.com/Scott Horton Show, you can name your own price to help support and make sure there's still new interviews to give away. So what do you think? 2 bits? $1.50? There are usually about 80 interviews per month, I guess, so take that into account. You can also cap the amount you'd be willing to spend in case things get out of hand around here. That's patreon.com/Scott Horton Show. And thanks, y'all. All right, you guys, Scott Horton Show. I'm back. ScottHorton.org, LibertarianInstitute.org, and Twitter.com/Scott Horton Show, of course. On the line, I've got our friend Eric Margolis, and he's such a great reporter, foreign correspondent, author of War at the Top of the World and American Raj, Liberation or Domination, both of which are just masterpieces. I mean, really, you've got to read these books. They're just so great. And for years, I said that and hadn't gotten around to reading the damn things yet. But now I have. And now, wow. You know, we all like his articles. We all read his articles at ericmargolis.com, at lourockwell.com, and owns.com. But these books are, man, they're for reading. Seriously. Okay. Mr. Margolis, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be back with you.
Good. Happy to have you here. So listen, here's something that's really important. The 1967 war between Israel and their neighbors. I guess beginning with Egypt, but then also Jordan and Syria and, more, the rest of Palestine. So I guess just to set up, right, the Israelis had already taken, was it 88% of what used to be historic Palestine, and the Palestinians had 22% left. And then ever since 67, the Israelis have controlled all of that too, I think. Something along those lines. I'll let you straighten me out. But anyways, people are talking about this because it's not just the anniversary of the war, but it's sort of like a Korea situation where the war never really ended. The consequences are still right in front of us all along. It's a ceasefire, but it's not a peace, and it's still a problem sticking in a lot of places and causing a lot of controversies all around. So the reason you're on is because you're a brilliant genius and you know everything about this and the real context for people to understand what happened. And why is it such a big deal, the 67 war? And I'm sorry to ask a question so broad in such a way, but then again, I know that you know how to work with that.
Scott, we really don't know what happened yet. The truth has not come out. What we do know is that in June of 1967, there were rising tensions in the Levant, the region around Israel and the surrounding region, and between Israel and Egypt, and particularly between Israel and Syria. And there were raids by Palestinian fedayeen, as they were known in those days. They'd be called terrorists today. And there were all kinds of threats going back and forth. The Israelis felt very vulnerable because while they had won the 1956 Arab-Israeli war, brilliantly, President Eisenhower had ordered them to get out of Sinai, which they had occupied. So, and they were, the Israeli news media kept broadcasting this, said, oh, you know, we're just clinging on to the beaches here in Israel, and there are 100 million Arabs who are coming to throw us into the sea. That was the official story, when in fact the truth was something quite different. But tensions were very high. The West wanted to overthrow Egypt's leader, Gamal Nasser. He's a nationalist, and won Western influence in the Arab world, and he wanted to support the Palestinians in their struggle. The Israelis wanted to overthrow Nasser and get rid of him, and they wanted to use their main objective was the conquest of the West Bank for historical and religious and geopolitical reasons. So that was it. Tensions were simmering, and at that point, just bear with me for one more minute because there's a lot of material here.
Sure.
At that point, there were very high military tensions. The Egyptian army was on alert inside of Egypt, not in Sinai. The Russians, the Soviets, Soviet GRU intelligence passed a report to the Syrians and the Egyptians that the Israelis were massing a number of brigades underneath the Golan Heights, preparing to seize the strategic Golan Heights of Syria. This apparently was not true, but the Soviet report caused Egypt then to say, well, not cause Nasser to do two things. First of all, to support his Syrian allies, he ordered some Egyptian troops into Sinai, but in a defensive posture. And he ordered, fatally, the closure of the Straits of Tiran, which is a narrow waterway that's between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which is the mouth, the exit from the only Israeli port on the Red Sea, which was Eilat. So these were immediately seized upon as acts of war, and the Israelis had been waiting for something like this, and they pulled the trigger and went to war.
Okay, so importantly, because I think that's the point where people start saying, yeah, but I always heard that, no, Israel is always the innocent victim and it's always the other guy who started it, and so the problem must be you, Margolis. And you know what? I mean, I was raised that way, and not specifically by my parents, and honestly not specifically by my teachers or any specific TV show either, I think. It's just everybody knows that, always. Just like the New York Times coverage of the 50th anniversary this year is about, as Adam Johnson pointed out at FAIR, the coverage is, it's been 50 years since Israel has been burdened with the occupation of the Palestinians. It's just, that's the point of view always, is from the point of view of the Israelis, never from the point of view of Martians just showing up in orbit and looking from a third-person objective perspective. Certainly not from the Egyptians' point of view or the Palestinians' point of view or something like that. And so the knee-jerk, I think, is already right there. And yet, Ben-Gurion himself gave a famous speech, which I'm not sure why they published this or what it was. I thought it was some kind of secret speech to the party or something, where he said, hey guys, even if we lie to everybody else, we got to at least be honest with ourselves for the real history here, that just because the Egyptians had moved their troops into Sinai does not mean they were preparing to attack us, and we all know that. And we chose to go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity, as you just said.
Well, that's right, Scott. And the Israeli public was very worried because they heard all this government propaganda about the Arabs coming to crush them. But in effect, the Israelis had been long preparing to seize the West Bank and Sinai as well. So the Israelis decided to go to war. But what's very interesting here is that the Israelis won the war on the first day, and that was by launching surprise air attacks, catching the entire Egyptian and Syrian and part of the Jordanian Air Force on the ground and destroying them. The Israelis had excellent intelligence. They sent female agents over into Egypt, supposedly Germans, but they were actually Israelis, and they went to bed with Egyptian pilots and base commanders, seduced them, got all the information on when the Egyptian planes would take off.
No kidding.
Yes, go on air patrols. And you can picture a lovely girl saying to this Egyptian, "Oh, Commander, is it your planes are so beautiful? How many do you have at your base?" And anyway, the Israelis really
business is business, right?
they got an intelligence trove. They knew exactly where every Egyptian plane was and when they were fueled and when they would take off. Anyway, the Israelis struck early in the morning when the Egyptian Air Force was on the ground. At the same time, the commander of the Egyptian Armed Forces, Abdul Hakim Amr, who was a very close friend, a crony of President Nasser, was reportedly flying to the Sinai from Cairo, and he was up in his plane smoking pot, and was completely whacked out. People were going, "What do we do? What do we do, Field Marshal?" Well, the Field Marshal was not in the best of form. Anyway, the Israelis, having destroyed, the Egyptian Air Force and the Syrian Air Force too. In the Middle East, it's open ground. There's no shrubbery, no trees, nothing. Everything's in the open, and hence extremely vulnerable to air attack. He who controls the air in the Mideast wins the battle. Mm-hmm. And the Israelis then embarked on, they moved their forces quickly into Sinai. There were important battles around Rafah and Abu Agela and Bir Jaffa near the Gaza Strip. Then the Israeli armored columns raced for the Mitla Pass, which is about halfway in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, and seized the strategic pass and finally got to the canal. They defeated the Egyptian troops that they met. There were tank battles, there were important fixed position battles around Gaza and Han Yunis. The Israelis fought very well, but of course they had complete air support, and the Egyptians were massacred up in the open with no air support. They were just bullseyes for the Israeli Air Force. Now, but the big question, Scott, is I believe, I can't prove it, but I believe that President Lyndon Johnson gave the Israelis a green light, and that he provided Israel at least with complete aerial reconnaissance. It wasn't just these lovely Israeli blonde-haired spies. It was also U.S. air reconnaissance was given to Israel, and he knew where all the Egyptian positions were. The same thing happened in the 1973 war as well. And the Americans have always denied it, but I believe it was true. They wanted to overthrow Nasser, and the Russians were not particularly happy with him either, so I don't know about their motives. And then there was the case of the USS Liberty.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what then do you suspect was the motive for the Liberty attack if Johnson was already playing ball with them to such a degree at that point?
I don't know. I really don't know. The Israelis have never revealed what their motives were. The Liberty was a converted Victory ship that had been set up by the Navy as an intelligence ship. It was off the coast of Gaza, and there was monitoring communications in the area. It was monitoring Israeli plans to attack the Golan Heights in Syria. This is probably one of the reasons it was attacked, because the Israelis claimed it was the Syrians who started that fighting, which is not true. Anyway, the Israelis launched severe air attacks on the Liberty, killing many U.S. sailors. The ship was torpedoed. According to the stories, the Israeli PT boats came and they actually machine gunned American sailors in the water.
Yeah, on their life rafts. I've interviewed 2 survivors of that attack.
Well, it was a scandal, and it was terrible. And
So, Eric, getting back to the rest of the war, people can check the archives for USS Liberty. I've interviewed Ray McGovern about it numerous times, and others, including 2 different survivors, and that kind of thing, all in the archives at scotthorton.org. So now at this point, Israel's engaged with the Egyptian army, the Syrians on the Golan Heights. I think I remember even that the Syrians made some headway into northern Israel, but then they made a bad call and halted their progress to wait for daylight or something, and that gave the Israelis enough time to find them and blast them. But then also the Jordanians are involved, and the poor Palestinians, they don't have any sovereignty here. They were under the control of the Jordanian king up until this point. But then, so what happens to them?
Well, I wrote a column once about this called "The Man Who Never Smiled," about a Palestinian I'd met who had been driven from one place to another. The Israelis, when they conquered the West Bank, the Jordanians were playing a double game. They had since 1948, when they colluded with Israel to divide up Palestine. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state, according to the UN resolution, but in fact, the king of Jordan wanted to take over the area himself, and did. He made a secret agreement with the Israelis, and they divided up what was supposed to be the state of Palestine. So what happened then was that
let me stop you right there for just 1 second, because I hear this invoked a lot. It's almost like, oh yeah, well, West African slaves were sold by other blacks, so it's okay, or something, this kind of ridiculous argument. Oh yeah, well, the other Arab countries, they mistreated and they don't care about the Palestinians, and they backstabbed the Palestinians and all this, as though somehow that makes it okay for the Israelis to take advantage of the situation, just because the Jordanian king is willing to hang all the Palestinians out to dry. So what? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything, and yet that still has a talking point in 2017.
Absolutely. It's always brought up. There was a backstabbing. It was a very treacherous act. The Jordanian army, then known as the Arab Legion, was under orders not to put up much resistance. And in 1967, when the Israelis invaded, the Jordanians put up a perfunctory defense. The Americans may have also pressured them. Jordan, remember, is in a British-American protectorate. And then the Israelis stormed into the West Bank. They then expelled, this has been completely forgotten, they expelled at least 300,000 Palestinians from the West Bank, 100,000 Syrians from the Golan Heights.
Really? 300,000 Palestinians were pushed out of the West Bank during just the 6-day conflict there.
Yes.
And pushed into Jordan?
Into Jordan proper. And 100,000 Syrian civilians were pushed out of the Golan Heights, which Israel was determined to annex. Mm-hmm. And the Syrian city of Quneitra, I've walked through there, I've seen it with my own eyes, that it was leveled by Israeli bulldozers so that no people could ever come back there. So it was, we're talking between 4,000 and 500,000 people were ethnically cleansed or expelled, making the problem even worse.
And now, by the way, the Golan Heights always gets the short shrift, except from you. But now, so when 100,000 people were quote unquote cleansed from there, how many remained, and therefore, and not therefore, but and then how many remain to this day under Israeli occupation there? This is where it's not just Druze, but there's a population of Druze here who consider themselves Syrians and occupied by the Israelis, just the same as the Palestinians feel that way on the West Bank, correct?
Well, the Druze get along pretty well with the Israelis, and the Israelis have been very clever in their treatment of the Druze, unlike the Palestinians. So there are some Druze left on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, but not many.
But there are others there too, or not?
No. All the rest of the civilian population were expelled, driven out.
I see.
You drink coffee, I drink coffee, just about everyone drinks coffee. So why bother with anything but the best? Darren's coffee is roasted at his new shop in Claremont, Indiana. And coming soon, you can order on Amazon and support the show by using Scott Horton's affiliate link. DarrensCoffee.com. Because everyone deserves to drink great coffee. I love Bitcoin, but there's just something incredibly satisfying about having real, fine silver in your pocket. That's why commodity discs are so neat. They're 1-ounce rounds of fine silver with a QR code on the back. Just grab your smartphone's QR reader, scan the coin, and you'll instantly get the silver spot price in Federal Reserve notes and Bitcoin. And if you donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, he'll send you one. Learn more at facebook.com/commoditydiscs. commoditydiscs.com.
I mean, some of the only news out of there recently was when some of the Druze were shooting up Israeli ambulances where the Israelis were giving aid and comfort to al-Nusra in Syria. And the Druze were trying to make them stop because, hey, you're encouraging the al-Nusra guys to keep coming around and we're sick of it, which kind of makes sense. But anyway. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. If there's anything else I should ask about the Golan Heights, I don't know what it is. I guess other than how high is it and how important is that?
I can never remember how high it is. Just take it from me, it's high. Standing on the edge of the Golan Heights, I've walked the entire length of the Golan Heights. And it was particularly important during the 1973 war. That you can see deep into Israel. You can see almost to the coast from the top of the Golan Heights.
And they have military bases there.
It's covered with Israeli military bases and fortifications. Nobody knows that the Israelis built forts, but they did. I happen to be a fortress aficionado, and the Israelis built forts which were very useful in the 73 war. But the important thing is the Israeli bases on top of Golan, they have these high volcanic mounds there, and they have all kinds of electronic equipment on top of them that look deep into Syria. Mm-hmm. And they can listen to everybody's telephone calls in Damascus. Israeli long-range artillery on top of Golan can hit Damascus. It's only 30, 40 kilometers away. Mm-hmm. And you can see everything that's happening in Syria from there. So it's strategic. And the other point is that at the northern end of Golan is Mount Hermon, one of the highest snow-capped mountains in the region. And that is the source, that region there, is the source of an important portion of Israel's water. And the Israelis have grabbed it. That's one of their most important natural water resources. So you can be sure that Israel, which really annexed Golan and is putting settlements in there, never will give it up unless forced to a gunpoint.
All right, so now the Palestinians on the West Bank. How many millions of them are there? Do you know?
Well, we think. I had trouble with this when I was writing my book, American Raj, trying to determine the exact number of Palestinians. Best that I and other experts can come up with is 5 million. They're a total of 5 million. 3.5 million probably on the occupied West Bank, 2 million in Gaza. Okay. And then there are Palestinians in Israel. 20% of Israel's population are Palestinians. But it put them all together, and I think it was something like 5 to 5.5 million people. Now, when the Israelis ethnically cleansed the Palestinians in 1948 from the region, they drove out, by best guess, 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, bulldozed their villages, and took over and said, it's empty land. But that 750,000 has grown into millions now after 50 years.
And at that point, back in 48, when they did that, what percentage do you know, were exiled to countries in the region, to Syria, to Tunisia or Libya, whatever, as compared to were exiled to just Gaza and the West Bank? You know, people who weren't from there but were from what we now call Israel proper, who became refugees in Gaza, for example.
there was a Palestinian diaspora all over the Middle East. I used to do business with them in the Gulf, for example, and they were very capable. They were so much in advance of the other Arabs. They were the most educated of any of the Arabs. They were a merchant class of people with long experience. They were Phoenician ethos. But the single biggest recipient of Palestinian refugees in the Arab world was Kuwait, because Kuwait had suddenly found oil, but they had no people. So, and what was terrible was the single biggest expulsion of Palestinians after what the Israelis did was done by the Kuwaitis. I think it was in 2003. The Kuwaitis expelled 400,000 Palestinians and kicked them out because Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, had come out supporting Saddam Hussein.
Okay, so now, and then the deal is that the government of Israel since 1967, is it really right that they've just been determined that they're going to keep all of the West Bank? Let's put off Gaza for just a sec here, because the West Bank itself is such a big topic. That from the river to the sea, all of this belongs to us. It ain't the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. And if it takes us 50 years, it's going to be all ours, and there is never going to be an independent Palestine. But let's just jerk the world's chain for 50 years and pretend that we're always working on someday giving independence to these poor people, but then we never will. And then, I don't know. I still don't understand, even in that plan, what's supposed to happen to the Palestinian people. The 6 million that are there now, or however many it is there now, you're going to push all of them into Jordan? I mean, that's a pretty big trail of tears, man. I don't know if you could get away with that. I mean, they're clearly all effectively disarmed. But still, I mean, I don't know. I don't really get the plan. It doesn't make sense to me, even when I pretend, okay, I'm Netanyahu's father and this is what I want. It still doesn't make sense how they're supposed to carry it out. Or,
there is a method behind what the Israelis are doing. I agree with you. Israel is determined of taking over the entire and keeping the entire West Bank. It would prefer it without inhabitants, but you've got these Palestinians there. And I think the Israeli strategy, they're using salami tactics to gradually, quietly take over more and more and more. One of the Palestinian leaders said that, he said, we're negotiating with Israel over a pizza while Israel is eating it. And it was a good analogy. Israel is taking all the water in the region, which is the most important. All the aquifers underground are being dominated by Israel. They're moving in settlers all the time. And their plan, I think, I have no evidence of this, but I think, from my experience in the region, is that the Israelis are trying to make life so miserable for the Palestinians with checkpoints and searches and raids and blowing up houses, and that they're trying to encourage the Palestinians to leave and go somewhere else. They don't care where, just go somewhere else.
Except that here's the thing about that, is the Palestinians are like, no, this is my land, and screw you. And so the whole idea that at some point, the Arabs, you just have to bully them enough and they'll finally just give in and do what you say, it just isn't true. I mean, yes, you can march them at bayonet point. They're human beings. But break their will like a damn dog and get them to just give up their grandfather's land. It's not happening.
Well, it isn't. The Palestinians are fiercely resisting as much as they can, but they're under intense police control. Their ranks are infiltrated. The current Palestinian leadership of Abbas are effectively Israeli puppets. The Israeli intelligence service is infiltrated all the Palestinian groups. So it's very tough for them, but they will keep resisting. The problem is the day may come when the younger Palestinians say, to hell with it, we're going to move somewhere else to the Gulf. And the Israelis might take some bloody incident, bombs go over, a lot of Israeli civilians are killed, to do what the Serbs did in Kosovo, and that is march everybody at gunpoint into the desert.
Yeah, so not even into the river, but just into the Sinai, huh?
Well, in the Sinai, or, Ariel Sharon always used to say, he said, there is a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan.
Yeah.
And the Israelis are saying we'll expel them to Jordan. There's some sense to that. The Jordan is which was created by the British as a little puppet state. 60% of Jordan's population are Palestinians.
Well, because they're the ones that got ran off last time.
Exactly, and driven into the desert. So, there's always room for more Palestinians.
I say bring them all home from Jordan and give them Tel Aviv. How about that? Makes sense to me. So now let's talk about Gaza, because here's one that you hear all the time in just kind of conventional wisdom. And, I guess my conception for this interview, Eric, is sort of that it's a 101 for people who are new to this, because it's a complicated thing, and I know people don't know about it, because I used to not know about it. And so I figure that you and I are up against the old me who didn't understand this stuff. Who's occupying who, and since when, and why, and what in the hell. And one thing that we always hear is that, the poor little Israelis, as you say, they're clinging to the beaches. They're surrounded. The Arab hordes by the millions are coming to push them into the sea and all this. And the thing is that's really true, only it's not true about the Israelis. The Israelis are friends with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians. They're certainly not threatened by the Syrians. Hezbollah can keep them out, but certainly has no capacity to invade them from southern Lebanon. No one's threatening Israel like that. But that's exactly the story of how Israel is to the people of Gaza. They're the ones who are the tiny little besieged minority clinging to the beaches, surrounded by all sides, being threatened to be pushed into the sea, and yet they get shot just for fishing 3 miles off their own coast. They can't even leave and go live in Kuwait because they're not allowed to leave. They don't have an airport. They don't have access to the seas. They're complete, almost prisoners. The liberal 972 website, they say, listen, here's what you need to understand, Americans. The West Bank is a minimum security prison. The Gaza Strip is a maximum security prison.
That's right.
Millions of people. In fact, I think the polls say the majority of them are minors. They're children. They're the great-great-grandchildren of refugees who were only there because they're the wrong religion, Eric.
Scott, that's true. A lot of them were Christians, too. It is true. Gaza is a giant open-air prison or a human garbage dump. And it also fits into the plans of some Israeli far-right wingers. They want to create holding tanks inside the West Bank for Palestinians, as they've done in Gaza, and shove them into these camps, really surrounded by barbed wire, towers, and troops. And the best analogy is to South Africa's Bantustans. These little areas that were created to hold blacks. And I think that's what's going to happen under the guise of fighting terrorism. They're going to need more security, and we're going to lock them up.
The whole world seems to be opposed to it in terms of the populations of the countries. As far as anybody cares anyway, they're against the status quo. But apparently it's just American political power in the world that allows this to continue. Even the British and the French and the Germans are saying, stop this, right? It's just the Americans who allow it to continue.
Well, that's right. And as you correctly mentioned, the geopolitics of the region have changed because the Egyptian military dictatorship of General Field Marshal al-Sisi is completely in bed with the Israelis. So are the Saudis. And the Gulf Arabs are behind them because They're terrified of reforms in the Arab world and revolution. So they're in a sort of reactionary coalition. They're all against the Palestinians, and the Israelis have done a brilliant job of mobilizing everybody against the Palestinians and isolating them from the rest of the world. There are big oil and gas deposits off the coast of Palestine, which the Israelis are exploiting. They won't let the Palestinians have even a drop of the stuff.
Yeah, man. All right, I want to mention one more thing. Do you need to go?
No, I can talk for a few more minutes.
So listen, I was reading this article about Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. Is in the Independent. I couldn't have read it in the San Antonio Express News, I don't guess. But he's coming to San Antonio. And, I guess he's on tour with his new band, whatever it is. But the article is about how him and Elvis Costello and just a couple of other people who are big, and he's kind of old and washed up now, right? No offense or anything, but just, anyway. There's so few people in American music in his industry who are willing to speak out about this, who are willing to do anything about this, because they'll be destroyed. As he puts it, he is routinely called a Nazi. And this is a guy who we all know. Anybody who's familiar with Pink Floyd at all knows the story of how he grew up without a father because his father died fighting the Nazis. That's the story of The Wall, right? And yet he's a Nazi, and they attack him constantly for sticking up for the Palestinians. And it seems to me like at some point there's got to be a tipping point where when it's that absurd of an accusation, where at some point it stops sticking, right? And people realize that the only reason they call Roger Waters a Nazi is because they don't have a single rational argument to justify what it is that he's complaining about, which is the way that the Palestinians are occupied and treated under this foreign military occupation and colonization of their land. They don't have anything to say. And so all they can do is call him a Nazi, and yet to me, this is so laughable. And yet, as he's complaining in the Independent article, it still works. At least in the music industry, it still works. So I wonder, what do you think about that? Isn't it too late for us to have to put up with that kind of crap?
No. The American media is very influenced by Israel and its supporters, and the music industry, Hollywood. Look, every night I turn on the TV, and they're either Nazis or there are Arab terrorists, and it goes on and on. And yes, it's true. More and more people the views are changing. But there's still, the problem is, I know if I were to write a column saying anything non-negative about the Palestinians, I'd get barraged with hate mail. And the editors of my papers would be barraged. How dare you? How could you let Eric Margolis write like that? Whereas not a letter comes in from somebody who's supporting the Palestinians. So you get only one side of the argument. And it's very effective. This is the old Soviet technique from the 1930s of blasting any and all critics with just a torrent of abuse and vitriol and calumny. And it works over and over again. And now, in fact, what's happening is that you have groups who are pro-Israel groups who are beating the drums about terrorism, and have blown this whole terrorism thing up into a huge Frankenstein. And this reflects negatively on the Palestinians. They're just a bunch of terrorists.
Yeah. All right, well, listen, I'm sorry I've kept you so long. I appreciate your time so much, Eric, as you know. I learned so much from you, and I always love reading you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Scott. It's always good talking to someone as informed and literate as you are. Cheers.
All right. You too. All right, you guys. That's the great Eric Margolis. Read his books. War at the Top of the World, The Struggle for Afghanistan and Asia, revised and updated, and American Raj, Liberation or Domination, both of which are just incredible books. That one is Resolving the Conflict Between the West and the Muslim World. Hear, hear. EricMargolis.com. Spell it like Margolis. EricMargolis.com, and you can read them at LRC and at UNS.com, UNZ-UNS.com. I'm Scott Horton. Thanks, you guys, very much for listening and all your kind words of me being sick and this and that and all the stuff you said. So thank you again. Check out scotthorton.org and follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Thanks. Hey, y'all, Scott here. The thing is, I need you guys to help me to get these download numbers up. So do me a favor and sign up for the podcast feeds of this show. You can choose the whole show or just the interviews at iTunes and Stitcher. All the buttons you need are at the top of the right margin at scotthorton.org. The more subscribers I have, the more iTunes and Stitcher will help promote the show to new listeners. If you're a hardcore fan, brand new or from way back, please leave them customer ratings and reviews, too. Trying to get these wars ended.